Hello, in this lecture we are going to discuss sociology of gender. Gender is one of the central concerns of social science in general and sociology in particular. Since from its inception, sociology has been concerned with social stratification and forms of inequalities in society. Gender has been one of the most universal and fundamental categories of social stratification, and gender relations and inequality have been one of the central concerns of sociology. Initially, concerns of gender emerged as a subdiscipline of sociology that focused on women. However, over time, there have been very interesting and fundamental developments within the field, ultimately leading to the emergence of what is known as feminist sociology. In this lecture, we are going to have the following sections for our presentation. What is sociology of gender? Some of the basic concepts. Why is it important to study gender? And feminist sociology. So, we come to the first part of what is sociology of gender. Sociology of gender initially emerged with the concern for including in sociology the issues and experiences of women. Since the 1970s, there emerged a concern for including women in the course content of sociology in American universities as an aftermath of the second wave feminist movement. However, it was still titled as Sociology of Women, and a criticism emerged that mainstream sociology was androcentric in nature and that it still ignored women. Therefore, an approach to add women emerged to address the male-centric nature of traditional sociology. The sociology of women gradually gave way to sociology of gender. This fundamental shift recognized the fact that we can never understand women's status in society and their issues unless we seek to understand the relation between women and men. Thus, there emerged a recognition for gender as a relational category and the need to understand men and masculinity. Under some basic concepts, the first one we are going to look into is sex and gender. Traditionally, sociological literature makes a distinction between the concepts of sex and gender. Broadly speaking, sex refers to the biological differences between male and female. When an infant is born, the infant comes to be labeled boy or girl depending on their sex and biological differences. Gender, on the other hand, refers to the constructions of masculinity and femininity. In other words, gender refers to the characteristics that define masculinity and femininity. There are several traits that are categorized as masculine and feminine. For example, strong and tough are seen as masculine characters, while being weak and soft are associated with the feminine character. Similarly, pink and blue are gendered colors, the former regarded as feminine and the latter as masculine. The process of gender socialization contributes to the constructions of masculinity and femininity. One of the most important thinkers who contributed to the idea of gender socialization is the sociologist Anne Oakley. She argues how gender identities are constructed and gender appropriate behaviors are learned, particularly during early childhood within the family, in the school, and so on. Patriarchy. Patriarchy basically refers to a system of male domination over females. Patriarchy is seen as a universal phenomenon by feminist thinkers. Literally speaking, the term patriarchy means rule of the male head of a social unit like family tribe. The patriarch is typically an elderly male person who has legitimate powers over others in the social unit. Feminist sociologists and thinkers have developed a number of theories that aim to understand the basis of women's systematic subordination to men in society. The term patriarchy is not merely a descriptive term that explains how societies construct male authority and power, but is an analytical category. The use of the term patriarchy as an analytical category emerged in the 1970s in the West, specifically in the writings of radical feminists. Patriarchy has been viewed as more than just the subordination of women. It has been pointed out that not all men are powerful in a patriarchal system. For example, younger men in the family have less authority and power than older men. Similarly, the lower class, underprivileged, homosexual men, and in the Indian context, the Dalit men, have lesser or no power as compared to the upper class and upper caste men. These men, who are oppressed and exploited by powerful men, are denied access to resources of the society and face discrimination of various kinds. R.W. Connell was amongst the earliest to give a kind of hierarchy of gender, where he had emphasized on the different kinds of access to power that men and women have. So, there is also this kind of differential access that men have to what may be considered as patriarchal power. However, in spite of the fact that certain classes and categories of men are the targets of patriarchal authority, men across different cultural contexts generally claim more resources and power than women in their families or communities. Kamla Bhasin identifies the following areas of women's lives as coming under patriarchal control. 1. Women's productive or labor power. Men control women's productivity both within the household and in paid work. Within the household, women provide free service to their children, husbands, and other members of the family throughout their lives in the form of household labor and care work. Men also control women's labor outside the domestic space. They may force women to earn money by selling their labor, or they may prevent them from working. Sometimes they may simply appropriate women's income or selectively allow them to work. This control over and exploitation of women's labor, Bhasin points out, means that men benefit materially from patriarchy. They derive concrete economic gains from the subordination of women. Second is women's reproductive power. Men also control women's reproductive power. In many societies, women do not have the freedom to decide how many children they want, when to have them, whether they can use contraception or terminate pregnancy, etc. In patriarchal societies, the ideology of motherhood is glorified, which becomes another way of oppressing women in such societies. It is as if without motherhood, women do not seem to have any reason to exist in society. Third is the control over women's sexuality. Women are expected to provide sexual services to their men according to their needs and desires. In patriarchal societies, a moral, cultural and legal regime exists to restrict the expression of women's sexuality outside marriage, whereas a blind eye is turned towards male promiscuity. Women are also seen as objects of men's pleasure. Rape and other sexual violence against women are other different ways of controlling women's sexuality, very important ones, through an invocation of shame and honor. Women's mobility. In order to control women's sexuality, production and reproduction, men need to control women's mobility. Controlling women's mobility include putting restrictions on leaving the domestic space, a strict separation of private and public, limits on interaction between the sexes, and so on. Property and other economic resources. Most property and other productive resources are controlled by men and are passed from one man to another, usually from father to son in a patriarchal setup. Even where women have the legal right to inherit such assets, a whole array of customary practices, emotional pressures, social sanctions, and sometimes plain violence prevent them from acquiring actual control over them. Women are also, in ways brought up to not accept, not demand their legal right to inherit property. How could you ask for it? Haven't your parents, haven't we as your brothers brought you up, done this for you and that for you? How can you demand property? There are different kinds of pressures that are put on women so that even when they have in societies, in certain societies, even when they have the legal right to inherit property, they may often not do so. They may not enforce that right. Thus, Bhasin argues that patriarchy has a material basis of exploitation of women. Gender and sexuality is among other basic concepts that we are now doing. The simple dichotomy between sex and gender gets to be complicated by some of the queer feminist understandings of gender. The traditional understanding of sex as a biological category and gender as a social construction is challenged by them. Queer feminists argue that we need to challenge the biological determinism that shapes the distinction between male and female, perceived as having biologically determined differences. According to Judith Butler, not only are masculinity and femininity socially constructed, but so are male and female. In other words, she emphasizes upon sexual difference between male and female is socially shaped. Rather than seeing gender as a universal of who we are, it should be seen as what we do. She argues that gender identities are not something to be imposed by the social structure, but gender identities are performative in nature. Thus, by bringing in the question of sexuality and showing how sexuality gets to be imposed as something natural stemming from biology, the queer feminists seek to go beyond the traditional sex-gender dichotomy. We now come to the third part of our presentation to see why is gender important. Gender matters in social life, and it is one of the fundamental and universal organizing principles of the social world. It organizes our identities and self-concepts, structures our interactions, and is one of the fundamental bases of allocation of power and resources in society. Gender gives shape and meaning to individuals, social relations, and institutions. We cannot fully understand the social world without taking into account gender. Thus, the social world needs to be viewed through a gendered lens. This points to the importance of using gender as a category of analysis and not merely add the issues of women to sociological literature. Often this adding of women, to the literature or to approaches have often been seen as, add gender and stir, and that kind of is seen to have done away with the androcentric problem, androcentric approaches of disciplines. That is simply not the solution. So therefore, we must look at social institutions, the social world, at ourselves through a gendered lens. Feminist sociology. What are the main claims of feminist sociology? Feminist sociologists have argued that sociology has been a male-dominated discipline from its inception. Therefore, the entire discipline of sociology needs to incorporate a gendered lens to look at the social reality. Women's issues remain sidelined in mainstream sociology and are best incorporated as a subdiscipline identified as sociology of gender. Feminist sociology questions the mainstream concepts, theories, and methods of sociology, which, since its inception, have been male-centric, given the hegemony of the male scholars and researchers over the discipline. Feminist scholars have argued that what is passed as objective and neutral standpoint or knowledge in mainstream sociology is actually men's perspective, and hence women cannot relate to it because their subjective experiences are quite different. And therefore, rather being objective and neutral, it is a particular point of view that is coming from the men, from a male perspective, or from male perspectives, but still male in nature. Hence, feminists like Sandra Harding, Dorothy Smith, etc. have contributed to the standpoint theory to argue that we need to develop sociological knowledge from the standpoint of those who are marginalized. Their specific subjective experiences provide them with a standpoint that gives them an epistemic privilege to construct new knowledge. Another important critique that feminists have brought in to question the validity of mainstream knowledge in sociology is the binary between nature and culture. In this binary, women are seen as closer to nature and men as closer to culture. This construction of the natural women and cultural men arise from the belief that women are more strongly tied up with their biological beings, that they have not been able to transcend their biological birth being biological. So, therefore, they are tied to nature, whereas men have been able to transcend that and have been more able to identify themselves with culture. Ultimately, feminists have argued that such binaries are social constructions. We get that basically from Sherry Ortner. According to Abbott and Wallace, feminists have made the following criticisms of sociology. 1. That sociology has been mainly concerned with research on men and by implication with theories for men. Even when they would be studying women perhaps, or what could have been their role in it, they would have preferred to talk to men. That research findings based on all male samples are generalized to the whole of the population, that areas and issues of concern to women are frequently overlooked or seen as unimportant, that when women are included in research, they are presented in a distorted and sexist way. It's a very important critique that feminist sociology has mounted against sociology that has existed for a very long time. That sex and gender are seldom seen as important explanatory variables, that when sex and gender are included as variables, they are just added on. In short, feminists have labeled the enterprise of sociology as sexist because it fails to address adequately the issues and experiences of women, and in their biased explanation, the structural reason for the subordination of women is not questioned. More often than not, the domination and oppression of women are either ignored or are seen as natural. So, in conclusion, we can say in this introductory module on sociology of gender, we discussed the following. We talked about what is this field of study and what it deals with. Second, we discussed some of the fundamental concepts of sociology of gender. Third, we sought to understand the importance of studying gender in sociology and social science in general. And finally, we also discussed what is known as feminist sociology, why is it important, and how sociology as a discipline has evolved towards feminist sociology. Thank you.